In this lesson, we'll take a look at the process of adding shadows to our Maya light sources. Okay, so again, we're going to be taking a little bit of a detour from our aircraft that we've been working with. So we're just going to use this really simple object to demonstrate. Now, if I were to come in and take a quick render, what we have currently, you can see we have no lights and really no shadows. So the first thing we need to do when adding shadows is first create a light source. Now we can use just about any light source we want, and the process of adding shadows to any light source is really going to be just about the same. Okay, so I'm going to start with, in my case, just a simple little point light. Move this somewhere over into my scene. And now if I come in and take a quick render, you can see that we do have the light source that we can see, but we have no shadows. So by default, any sort of a light source that we create in Maya does not cast shadows. We have to come in and explicitly tell it to cast and calculate shadows, and we have to do this on a per light basis. So let's start by selecting this light. Press Ctrl A on our keyboard to open up the attribute editor. And up at the sort of top area of your light, you should have this little shadows roll out. So if we click on this, that should expand it. We have a couple of different shadow types that we can use. We have depth map shadows, which we're really not going to talk about in this course, but what we will show you is the ray trace shadows. Now, ray trace shadows are usually a little bit more accurate. They take a little bit longer to render compared to a depth map shadow, but again, the accuracy is much higher. So let's take a look at what we have currently if we were to use the ray trace shadows and render this. Again, if you take a look, you see no shadows. Now, we have enabled shadows in the light, but the thing that we also have to keep in mind is if we're rendering this inside of Maya software, there's another option that we need to turn on. Now, this is found inside the render settings. If we go into the Maya software tab, scroll down and look for this ray trace quality. Okay, and you can see by default ray tracing in the Maya software render is disabled. So without ray tracing enabled, that means we cannot see the effect of ray trace shadows. So let's turn on ray tracing and now see the effect that we get. Okay, now you can actually see some shadows starting to be cast from this light source. With these ray trace shadows, they're able to actually pass through these transparent areas of this tube and start to cast some transparent shadows into our scene, which is really nice. Now, this additional option that we go through for turning on ray tracing, we only need to do that if we're rendering in Maya software. If we happen to be rendering in something like Mental Ray, as soon as we switch to Mental Ray and hit render, that should be all that we have to do. Okay. Now, one of the nice things about these particular ray trace shadows is the fact that we can start to get these to look really realistic. So in the real world, if we have shadows that are being cast by an object, normally we would start to see the shadows kind of start to soften up as they get a little bit further away from the shadow casting source. So to do this, we can start to increase this light radius. Now the light radius really sort of does what the name suggests. It tries to make the light appear as though it's coming from a larger source and not just this little point of light. If you've ever seen that light comes through some sort of a diffuser or even a lampshade, because the light's coming from a larger area, typically we'll get much softer shadows. So bumping up this light radius, I'll go ahead and save this image for comparison and re-render. And now you can start to see that we do have some softening of our shadows over here. And the higher we go with this value, the softer our shadows become. Okay, very nice. So we do have some softening of our shadows, but one of the things that is very obvious at this point is the fact that we also have a lot of noise, and a lot of pixelization, and a lot of graininess in these shadows. So this is where this shadow raise attribute comes in. So this is sort of a sampling value. So as we start to crank this value up, we should start to get a little bit more of a softening effect in these shadows. Not quite so noisy and quite so grainy. The thing that we also have to keep in mind, though, is that as we start to bump this level up, we will start to see some pretty significant slowdowns in our render. So in this case, obviously the renders look much better, or at least the shadows look much better. But you can see in this case I've gone from a render time of 2 seconds up to now about 5 seconds. Okay, so again, as we start to crank this value up, we start to get nice, soft shadows, but again, we start to see a pretty significant hit in our render times. So usually, what I like to do, as opposed to just starting with a really, really high value, try to start with low values and gradually start to work this way up until you find a value that gives you the right mix between quality and speed in your renders. Another thing that can also affect the quality of our shadows is our anti-aliasing, which we looked at in one of our earlier lessons or one of our previous lessons. So inside of Metal Ray, if I go over to the Quality tab and bump up my max sampling level to something like 2 and re-render that, these additional anti-aliasing samples should also help to smooth out our shadows. But again, all of these things start to compound, and you can see overall starts to result in a pretty dramatic slowdown of our scene, so be prepared for that. And you can see now in this case I'm up to about 20 seconds, so a huge, huge increase in my render time from what we were getting earlier with about 2 seconds, as you can see here. Okay, now one last attribute that we have is the ray depth limit. Now the ray depth limit will help us to fix some rendering errors that we have here. If you look very closely, you can see that we do have some shadows being cast on the ground, but if we had this sort of a reflective, kind of a chrome type surface around our object, then we should be able to see the reflection of the shadows in this shiny metal. And in this case, you can see that we don't. So that's where this ray depth limit comes in. The more ray traces or the more interactions that we have to calculate, the longer our renders take. So by default, this is set to a really low value. So if we were to bump this up to maybe something like 2 or 3, and again re-render, now that starts to look much more realistic, where now we can actually start to see the reflections of our shadows in some of these shiny areas. But again, all of these things will start to slow down our renders, so now we're up from 20 seconds to a little bit closer to 40 seconds. Okay, so that's a look at how we can start to introduce some nice realistic shadows into our scenes, and how we can start to correct some of the common rendering errors that we can start to experience whenever using these shadows. Now, if you'd like to learn more about shadows and some of these other shadow types like the depth map shadows, we actually discuss these in quite a bit more detail in our Introduction to Lighting in Maya course.